Hello, good morning. Very warm welcome to you to this session on government priorities for COP26. Good morning, I'm Bronwen Maddox, I'm the director of the Institute. We're delighted to have had the Net Zero conference yesterday, and thank you all for taking part in that and sending in so many good questions and taking part with the terrific panels that we had. And we're delighted to have today the Secretary of State, Kwasi Kwarteng, Secretary of State, as you know, for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. He's going to talk for about 10 minutes. I'm going to fire some questions at him for about 10 minutes, and then there's about 10 minutes for you all to ask him questions. Please do start sending them in. You just have to paste them into the Q&A function, and we will be right off. So with that, Kwasi Kwarteng, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to what you have to say.
Very good to see you, Bronwen. And I just wanted to start really by saying thank you very much for inviting me. I think this is really important, and the work you're doing is extremely relevant and important to what we're trying to achieve in government regarding net zero. I know that you've had a very good day yesterday. I know you've had excellent speakers. My friend and former colleague Amber Rudd was there. Tim Lord, who I worked with very closely as the Energy Minister, Dieter Helm, Chris Stark. There's some excellent panelists, and also I think Darren Jones, who is the current chair of the House of Commons Select Committee. What I wanted to do was really sketch out my own journey in this space, which happily I think combines with a lot of the evolution that the government has had. You'll remember, some of you, that I was made Energy Minister, Minister of State for Energy and Clean Growth in July 2019. I was appointed as a Minister of State in Bays. And really at the core of my brief then was the net zero plan, the net zero legislation. People will remember that the net zero legislation was passed at the end of June. It got the Royal Assent at the end of June 2019. And why I go through all this recent history is to show the evolution. We've really made a lot of strong, I think, strides in the right direction on this. So coming in July 2019, all we had at that time was the legislation. And what I commissioned immediately was some sort of pathways. You know, what did we have to do, particularly in the power generation sector, to get to net zero by 2050. That work was, I think, really good work from the department. The department focused very intently on how we could get to net zero, the different elements, you know, the transport requirement, the power sector, heat and buildings, and I can talk about that a bit later. And over that time, over the 18 months that I was Energy Minister, we managed to inform very largely the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. I think Bays took a leading role in shaping that 10-point plan, and then flowing from the 10-point plan and being allied to it, mutually supportive of it, was, of course, the Energy White Paper, which landed and was published in December 2020. It was only 2 months ago. But again, I think that was well received and gave an indication of our direction in terms of where we wanted to go. And so, having been made Secretary of State only 5 weeks ago, in my conversations with the Prime Minister, it was very clear that delivering net zero, sort of delivering all that policy work that I've been involved with as Minister of State, was a clear priority of my job as Secretary of State. And of course that coincides, as you all know, with 2021 being the year of COP26. So my predecessor, Alok Sharma, as you all know, wore both hats for a while. He was Secretary of State for Bays and President of COP26, but it was inevitable, I think, once we postponed the COP26, that we needed a full-time president of it. And that's a job that he will achieve very ably. So what I'll do now is I'll just say a few words about the 10-point plan. I think it is extremely ambitious, and I think it dovetails very neatly into our presidency of COP26. So the 10-point plan, the first point actually was the offshore wind ambition, which we have 10.4 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity now, and we want to reach 40 gigawatts by 2030. And I think that's eminently achievable. If you think that I think about 9 gigawatts is in construction, there'll be a further 12 gigawatts, up to 12 gigawatts in the auction this year. That takes us to about 31, and then a subsequent auction we feel that we can get to the 40, to the point where, let us say, if the fifth auction round is in 2023 and there's 9 gigawatts on stream there, then we can get to the 40 gigawatt target. And I think that's hugely significant. One of the big things that's happened really since 2012 is that coal has been almost eliminated from the power generation system. And that's an extraordinary fact. Many of you around this table will remember, if only dimly, the industrial struggles of the 1970s, the miners' strike of the 1980s, and really demonstrates how coal was absolutely central to the economic and largely political life as well of this country. And to have a situation where today coal is responsible for only 2% of the electricity that's generated in the UK is an extraordinary development. And I think that's something that we want to drive also in COP. We want to be able to persuade other countries to come off coal. And that was something which I was very focused on as Energy Minister when I was co-chair with Jonathan Wilkinson of Canada of the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And that was that will be a central plank, I think, of our energy diplomacy at COP26, encouraging other countries to come off coal in the way that we've done. The second point of the 10-point plan was, of course, the hydrogen economy. The Prime Minister outlined very clear ambitions relating to hydrogen capacity, the production of hydrogen. And that's something, again, which we're very interested in talking about and exchanging ideas with international partners, colleagues, and other countries to see what we can do to kickstart the hydrogen economy. And of course, all of this flows from the fact that we have encouraged countries to increase their nationally determined contributions. I was very pleased to see at the end of last year, the Prime Minister commit to 68% reduction in emissions by 2030. And of course, it's reduction in emissions from 1990. That's the generally accepted base year. And a 68% reduction by 2030, I think, is achievable. It's challenging, no doubt, but it is achievable. And if I look back to 1990 and look at where we've come, and it's an often quoted statistic, but it deserves considerable thought. We've managed to grow the economy by nearly 80% since 1980, about 75%, over 75%. Yet carbon emissions have been reduced by nearly 45%. So it is possible to have economic growth and reduce carbon emissions. And people say, well, of course, you're just exporting those emissions. But even if you think about the export of emissions in terms of our trade, it's still more than a 30% reduction. Obviously, we need more. We need to do more. We need to be more focused. I think there are difficult areas that we need to be very imaginative about, particularly regarding the heating of homes and how we decarbonize domestic heat sources, either through electrification, through heat pumps, but also, again, as I say, through the possibilities of using hydrogen, perhaps blending hydrogen in the gas network. So, very broadly, in conclusion, I think COP26 really will revolve around 4 areas of discussion. I think there's a huge discussion to be had about green finance, about TCFDs, about how we use green accounting, green auditing, and hopefully we'll have a sovereign bond, a green sovereign bond for the first time issued in the UK. I mentioned the coal agenda, trying to take people off coal. I think there's a huge discussion about the rollout of EVs, low carbon emission vehicles, phasing out the internal combustion engine. There will be a discussion, I think, about carbon border adjusting, carbon leakage, carbon border adjusting taxes, perhaps. I think that has to be part of a multilateral discussion. And the other thing, which I haven't mentioned, is, of course, how do we bring people with us, particularly vulnerable people, people in much poorer countries? How do we try and convince them that a net zero future is the right path for the global economy? I think that's, again, a very challenging issue in international energy diplomacy and international diplomacy. But that's something that we have to, a challenge that we have to meet. So those are 4 broad areas where I think we hope to get considerable degree of agreement and make progress on in the COP26.
Kwasi, thank you very much. That's terrific. In exactly 10 minutes. Okay, it doesn't always happen. Let me start with some of the points that you have in fact touched on within the UK, and before going on to other countries and the COP. And I'm thinking particularly of the how to pay for it session that we had yesterday. Paul Johnson, who's head of the IFS, the think tank, said that the approach so far had been to put a lot of cost on electricity bills, and in effect this is regressive, that it hits poorer people harder, but that in his words, the politics had worked in that no one has noticed. On the other hand, we're really coming up to very big investments that have to be made to do something about domestic heating and transport. That's another question. And I wondered if you can just take us into government thinking a bit about how to do this and who's going to pay.
So I think one of the interesting things, and it wasn't really noticed actually, or wasn't much talked about in the last budget, was the gas levy, which was the first time that I think we'd ever done a move like this, or certainly the Treasury had introduced something like this. And that was an implicit recognition of the fact that there is this discrepancy between electricity pricing and gas pricing, and in order to incentivize decarbonisation, we would have to look at the relative pricing between electricity and gas, and I think that was an interesting step. So I think that one of the big challenges, as you pointed out, in terms of decarbonisation, is the domestic heating space. And clearly, in that, if gas is very, very cheap and electricity is relatively quite expensive, there's much less incentive to move away from gas, which emits carbon, to a non-carbon emitting source of power, namely electricity. So we have to think about that. That's where I think actually hydrogen does offer an answer. And people who know about the history of these things will know that town gas, if you go back before we went to natural gas, town gas, it was very dirty, but interestingly, town gas I think was 50% hydrogen. So in a way, we're kind of going back full circle. And I think if we can find a way of using hydrogen in our gas system, I think we can decarbonize the heating system effectively, while also trying to maintain, in the first instance, trying to perhaps reduce the gap between electricity and natural gas, and then shifting over from natural gas to a more hydrogen-based solution.
That's fascinating, and I think many people would find that inspiring, in the sense that we can quickly develop another technological.
Yeah, I mean it's not easy.
But it's not easy.
It can be done. It can be done.
But I just want to stay on this point about the gas levy, because obviously we're going through a rather cold winter at the moment.
Sure.
We've had a difficult year. Many are working from home, and so with higher bills than they might have, they're not going into their place of work. Is this a year? Is next year a year when that kind of measure is actually acceptable, given the pressure that people are under?
I agree. I think, and also we've had, and one of the things that we can't account for is the gyrations in the wholesale price of energy. Things like the oil price, that's gone up quite considerably in the last year. I mean, having created at the very beginning of 2020, it's now creeping up, I think, to sort of $60 a barrel in terms of oil and wholesale cost, and that was reflected in Ofgem's announcement, I think, last week about the energy price cap going up. So, rising bills is definitely something we need to consider, and also there's huge pressure in the economy. But I think the significance of the gas levy wasn't so much in terms of the level. I just think the concept of saying that we can use fiscal measures to discourage people from using carbon intensive heat sources, I think is an important one. And I think it can be used actually to try and incentivize the move away from carbon based heating, if you like. So that was I was just making a broad point there. And in terms of the actual levels of taxation, you will understand that's not something which is really in my portfolio. I mean, we'll have to wait and see in the budget what happens there.
Let me just bring in a couple of questions here, and this turns to other countries and how the COP26 is going to deal with them. And I've got a pair of questions. one, someone who hasn't given their name, saying, how will COP26 deal with those countries whose emissions have grown enormously over the last couple of decades? For instance, China up 151% between 2000 and 2015, India up 82%. And there's a parallel shorter one from Barry Woods saying China is promising to be carbon neutral by 2060. Why should we believe them?
Yeah, look, I think that's a fair point. And if you look at the story of these, I've written about this. I mean, China, the growth of China is probably the single biggest economic event in the last 50 years. And they have massively ramped up their carbon emissions. But I've always felt that it was almost condescending to assume that we cared more about our grandchildren than they did about theirs. They know that there's an environmental problem in China. They know that the rivers there are very polluted. The air is very polluted, and they don't want to leave a dirty China to their grandchildren any more than we want to leave a dirty UK to ours. And I think that their commitment to net zero by 2060, we've got to figure out how they're going to get there. But I think the commitment is a genuine one, because they not only see the environmental impact in terms of their own environment and their own rivers and their own polluted air, but they also see an economic opportunity because they see that the world, whether they like it or not, is moving towards a net zero. I think the Biden administration has a big part to play in this. What Biden has been saying about decarbonization, about the climate emergency. America, after all, is China's biggest market and has been for 30, 40 years. There are strong economic reasons and strong environmental reasons, frankly, why I fully believe that they're utterly sincere in having that target. Now, what they do to get there, that's part of an ongoing conversation, and we're going to have those sorts of conversations in G7. I haven't mentioned G7, but we've got the presidency of G7 this year, and also in COP26. But I don't doubt their sincerity. I think most people around the world, most governments in advanced economies, understand the logic and the need to decarbonize.
I was going to ask you this, and thanks for bringing us to that point of what use the UK might make of the G7 to advance some of this, some of the COP26 plans.
I think for me, and I think also for the COP26 president designate, Alex Sharma, my predecessor, I think G7 is very much almost like a precursor to COP. We can't see them discreetly. I think we've got to try and do a lot of the early influencing, the early suggestive points. We need to shape some of the conversation at COP26 previously at the G7, and I think G7 ministerial meetings that I have with counterparts and also other ministers will have, particularly the Secretary of State for International Trade. We're all going to be talking about the net zero agenda. We'll be talking about decarbonisation. I think the Prime Minister has made it very clear that this is a central priority of this government. And I think G7 will be very much a precursor. The conversations we have at G7 will very much be a precursor, a kind of staging post, if you like, ahead of the COP26 conference in the Conference on Climate Change in November. Okay,
thank you for that. Got a question from Tom Sass, who's one of the associate directors at the IFG, and he's written a lot of our net zero work, and he's saying, look, the policies announced in the 10-point plan do not put the UK on a path to net zero. By some estimates, they leave us off track for the 4th and 5th carbon budgets. What plans does the government have for further policy measures and a full plan ahead of the?
So the 10-point plan announced at the end of 2020 was never intended to be a cast iron watertight path to net zero. It was meant to be the start of a process, and if we did implement everything in there, it would get us a large way to hitting those targets. We need other policies, absolutely, and that's why the department has a heat and building strategy, I think, coming out in the next 6 weeks, hopefully in the first quarter this year. And that's a strong priority of mine, to try and get a debate about how we decarbonize buildings and heat. There's also a strong element of agriculture. How do we decarbonize agriculture? That's a conversation that needs to be had. And of course, the way in which we account for emissions, in our trade, imported carbon emitting goods, or goods which have emitted a ton of carbon in their production. All of these things need to be addressed. I've spoken about a multilateral action on carbon leakage, and the questioner is absolutely right. We haven't got the policies that get us there, but I think there are a lot of areas in which we need to think about more policies and more legislation. But the 10-point plan is clearly a start. And as I said in my introductory remarks, when I started the energy job in July 2019, is less than 2 years ago, we were much further away from the goal that we'd set ourselves.
You take one from James Dowling, who says, how big a role will solar play in the upcoming CFD auction? That's the contracts for difference, which I know is expert very expert audience, but that's one of the government's main mechanisms for getting to a low carbon economy. And he says you need an ambitious pot to build scale and a competitive market.
So again, I mean, I don't want to sort of trumpet all the achievements we've had in BEIS in the energy space in the last 18 months, but in January last year, I think actually February last year, we announced the Pot 1 auction. And you will know that the Pot 1 auction includes onshore wind and also solar. That was suspended in 2015. So in 2015, going into 2015, I stood on the manifesto in the Conservative Party, which essentially delayed onshore. We had a look at this. I looked at this with the Secretary of State at the time, and we said that in order to deliver net zero, we had to resuscitate the Pot 1 auction, and that's exactly what we did. And I think for the first time in 5 years, onshore wind developers, solar wind developers will have the opportunity to bid for capacity in this auction round. And I think that will grow. We'll see what the cap is, but I think the portion in subsequent rounds, the Pot 1 auction, I think, will be hugely important in terms of helping us reach our decarbonisation targets in power generation.
Okay, thank you for that. And we've got questions, as we did right through yesterday, about the Cumbrian coal mine and whether the government can, in good conscience, go ahead with giving it permission. What's your view?
Look, I think this is
Amberard said no way.
Well, that's I'm very pleased to hear. She's characteristically forceful in her views, but I think it was a difficult issue. I fully understand that one of it's a slightly mixed message to some people, but at the same time, we are committed to the steel industry, and the issue there was that the coking coal. It's two different things. So there's the coking coal, which is used in steel production, and there's thermal coal, which is used in electricity generation, power generation. And the view was that it was a local decision. So it was the local council that decided to give the go-ahead to the coal mine. The Secretary of State didn't overrule them in the interests of sort of local power, local devolution. And as I read now, I'm understanding that the council is re-looking at their decision. But I think there was a finely balanced argument in terms of the fact that if you don't produce coking coal and you have blast furnace steel, which we have, they're going to end up importing the coking coal anyway. So in terms of the global reduction of emissions, it doesn't actually make any effect. Actually increases it, because you're essentially shutting down a domestic source of coking coal and importing it from halfway around the world. So those are the finely balanced arguments, and it was felt that if we are committed to the steel industry, which we are, and we still have blast furnaces, that having a domestically sourced source of coking coal made more sense for a number of reasons. That was the thinking behind it. But as I say, I think the local council, as I read a couple of days ago, is revisiting this whole issue.
That's fascinating. I suspect you and your colleagues will have to get very fluent in that argument if the thing isn't revisited, because it is an argument.
Sure.
But these symbols stand for a lot.
No, I understand. It's a difficult issue. I totally understand that.
All right, we will have one from a Stanley Johnson from the Conservative Environment Network. This is, I believe, the Prime Minister's father, who's now international.
Hello, Stanley. How are you? Very good to see you. Well, I can't see you.
I hope he's not going to burst onto this screen right now. Let me just read out this question, which is, would you like to see COP26 adopt by consensus the global goal of carbon net zero by 2050 as a complement to the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement's global goals, that is not more than 2 degrees centigrade increase, better only 1.4 degrees centigrade increase. I detect that he's been constrained by the size of the box. What do you want?
Okay. Look, if we got agreement, international agreement on a net zero target, I think that would be a hugely significant step. I'm not expecting that. I think there's still a number of countries, developing countries that require more persuasion. But what we are trying to do is to increase ambition on this. And as I say, all I can talk about with extreme vividness is my own experience. And I was told very firmly 18 months ago that there was no way that it made any difference what we did because China was still not committed to this. The fact that the Chinese said that they wanted net zero by 2060, and there was no real pressure for them to say that, I think was hugely significant. It was also significant that when they said that, I think in October last year, within about 2 or 3 weeks, the Japanese had committed themselves to a net zero target at 2050, and the South Koreans had done so by 2050. I'm told, as far as I understand, there was a debate within the Indian government about coming out with a target in a year. And I think in politics that these indicative targets have a huge symbolism, huge impact, even when people, like we did when we passed 2019, we didn't really know how we were going to get there. Yet within 18 months, as I said, we had much more granularity, much more specific policies about our route towards net zero. Now, purists say, well, this isn't enough, but I can tell you it's a much bigger step and a much more positive development than appeared possible only in the summer of 2019.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got one from Lucy Johnson, I think no relation, and several other people just digging in on this point about green hydrogen. And she's saying, how are you going to ensure that we use green hydrogen as part of our central heating? And how will its production be paid for and scaled up as creating hydrogen is currently carbon intensive?
I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, she's saying not the panacea that conversations about hydrogen might suggest.
Yeah, it's not a panacea. Nothing is a panacea. I mean, that's one thing you learn very quickly as an energy minister. There's no one technology that's going to solve all our problems. People talk about nuclear fusion, they talk about hydrogen, they talk about all of these things. But if anything, it'll always be a mix of technologies that is likely to be the answer to our problems. But particularly about hydrogen, we're coming up with a hydrogen strategy in the next few months. I commissioned that as energy minister. And the key point of the hydrogen strategy is that we're doing both. We're essentially playing in both tournaments. We're doing green hydrogen, which is electrolyzer produced hydrogen. And we're also producing blue hydrogen, which has to flow also from the methane reformation process and is allied closely with carbon capture. And we made announcements, not only in the manifesto, but in the budget about, and also in the 10-point plan about our ambitious plans for carbon capture. I think blue hydrogen at the moment is more cheaply produced than green hydrogen, and in order to create a capacity to create a market, I think blue hydrogen is probably necessary in the first instance. And then once we've created enough production capacity and demand for hydrogen, I think the costs of green hydrogen will come down much as they did in the generation of offshore wind. And we may do that through an auction process or something similar. And then, so it's a twin track strategy. It's a blue hydrogen and a green hydrogen strategy in the first instance. And then if we can get the green hydrogen production down the cost curve, I think green hydrogen will have a bigger and bigger role to play. But that's the path that we see.
I'm going to just squeeze in one more from Chris Peters, an interesting point. Subnational carbon targets have proven effective in engaging local action on net zero, for example, the 2038 target in Manchester. So the question reads, can we do more to encourage targets like these?
I think we can. I mean, I think...
Do they work, though? I mean...
well, I think in terms of... I mean, one of the things that I've seen, again, only in the last 2 or 3 years, is a much greater awareness of net zero. Now, for the majority of the public, I think there's still a long way to go. But I was very surprised campaigning in the December 2019 election, how often, in fact, green issues, net zero actually came up on the doorstep. I mean, it wasn't on everyone's lips, but I've been a candidate in 5 general elections, and this one was by far the only election I can remember where green issues actually came up spontaneously, in as far as, you would knock on someone's door and they would quickly enter into a conversation about decarbonisation, about climate change, and things like the Australian bushfires were very much in people's minds. So I think having local targets is a really good way of focusing people in the grassroots on this issue. And I think we could do a lot more actually in raising awareness through local targets, local debate, climate assemblies, citizens assemblies, and that kind of thing. And I think I've said to colleagues in government that we could do a lot more in that space, trying to mobilise the public to a greater extent on these issues.
Well, I've promised that we finish at 12:30. We've in fact gone 1 minute over.
Okay.
There are tons of great questions, as you know, in this subject, and the questions are all good, and they're keeping rolling there. But we don't have time to answer them. So, or you in particular, you don't. So, Secretary of State, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that.
And everyone, thank you very much indeed for watching, and thank you for these great questions. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.